Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is Elizabeth Lewis. Now it's been a little while since I made a video about a founding mother, though they do usually come up once a week at our live videos on Wednesdays, so if you're new here, make sure you subscribe so you'll get a notification when that happens. But as for Elizabeth Lewis, she was married to a gentleman named Francis Lewis, and Francis's story is fascinating on its own. We will get into it at another time. Suffice to say, he was sent to the Continental Congress and signed a little thing called the Declaration of Independence. Now, back home, Mrs. Lewis is on Long Island in New York with her children and grandchildren when the British come a-knocking, and the British actually start firing cannons at their house. They knew who the Lewis family was, and they were coming very specifically for them. They're firing cannons into the house, and it blows a hole in the house. Mrs. Lewis goes and stands confidently in the hole made by a cannon. Now, one of her servants, or slaves, but in New York they called them servants, one of these servants said, "Mrs. Lewis, what are you doing?" And apparently Mrs. Lewis turned and said, "The same ball is not likely to strike the same place twice." Or something of that nature. We're not exactly sure. It was translated later. Anyway, the British end up getting off their ship and running over and coming in the house, and they start taking all the Lewis's stuff and, capturing the Lewis family. And one of the gentlemen went down and tried to take the buckles off Elizabeth Lewis's shoes. And he was real unhappy when he found out that they were fake silver. And Mrs. Lewis apparently responded by saying, "All that glitters is not gold." She was real confident. I mean, this was a dire situation. Luckily, at the time, generally women weren't simply killed. They were taken as prisoners, however, and her family were taken as prisoners to New York. Now, Mrs. Lewis was treated very harshly as far as an upper-class woman was concerned. There's no indication her children and grandchildren were in the cell with her, but she was put in a prison cell, given raggedy clothing and poor food, and it adversely affected her health very strongly. Now, one of her servants, whose name I am unable to locate no matter how hard I seem to try, one of her servants did end up bringing her some clothing and some food and snuck some of her letters out to get to Philadelphia. Eventually, these letters came to the attention of George Washington, who was not pleased, to say the least. And Washington actually contacts the British and says, "Hey, we have some of your gentlemen's wives in our custody too. Should we be treating them this way?" Very quickly, Elizabeth Lewis was released on parole. She was allowed to walk about New York City as she pleased, but she was not allowed to leave New York City. She was still technically a prisoner. Now, during this time, that same servant, whose name I cannot locate, unfortunately, who brought her food while she was in prison, he fell ill, and he was about to die. Now, it's interesting, he was a Roman Catholic, and there were not a lot of Catholics in New York. There weren't a lot of Catholics in the colonies, except for really Maryland was kind of a safe haven for Catholics at the time. So it's very interesting that he was there, which may indicate he might not have been a slave. He might have been an indentured servant, but again, hard to tell. Can't really know. We do know he was a servant of hers, and he was a Roman Catholic because he wanted the last rites, and she was able to contact a Catholic priest to come from Philadelphia. She used the help of some of her friends and husband in the Continental Congress to send him from Philadelphia to sneak through the British lines in New York City and give this gentleman the last rites and then sneak back out. And that gentleman passed away peacefully. Now, as for Mrs. Lewis, she was in prison for 8 months, or at least in custody in New York for 8 months before she was finally released, and her health had taken a serious toll at this point. She traveled to Philadelphia to meet up with her husband, Francis, and while she was there, she met her son, Morgan Lewis, and his new wife, who was a daughter of Robert Livingston. She was a member of the wealthy Livingston family, and she met the daughter-in-law for the first time, seems to have been satisfied, and then Elizabeth Lewis passed away just a few days later at the age of 64. And I do want to note that her son, Morgan Lewis, was also a future governor of New York State and would use much of the family's wealth to pay for state militias during the War of 1812 and was an asset in winning the War of 1812. But I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, definitely hit like. If you're new here, make sure you hit subscribe. We do that live video once a week. I put out 3 other videos like this during the week, and I've started putting out interviews on Thursday. We have so much going on. It's a lot of fun. If you'd like even more, you can subscribe to my Patreon page through the link below, because I have all sorts of extra content about the American Revolution there and about the channel itself. Thank you so much for watching, and I will be back to you tomorrow with that live video. So keep on watching.